Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I certainly grew up, and most of you, I think, did too, believing that the Great War ended on the 11th of November 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 4th year of the war. And in a limited sense, that is true. The war on the Western Front ended on that day. The problem remains, though, that despite the capitulation of the Central Powers and the conclusion of peace treaties among victors and vanquished, war in various guises continued in a huge swath of Europe, in the east and south of the continent and beyond. That's why I want to suggest that textbook revision is in order, and we ought to take a look at the 11th of November as one of the points at which the Great War turned into something resembling violence and not peace. Now, if simply to make the point dramatically, from Finland to the Baltic states, to Poland, to Romania, to Hungary, to the Ottoman Empire, to the Middle East, across to the Reef in Morocco and up to Ireland, no one found peace on the 11th of November 1918. In fact, the intensification of violence after the 11th of November 1918 makes me flirt with the title, The Second Great War. The reason is my early years as a demographic historian, a medical historian. Between 1918 and 1923, in countries marked by armed conflict, more than 12 million people died. Between 1914 and 1918, the best estimates we have for the death toll is about 11 million. I would say comparable is probably the way. But the distribution of those deaths was entirely different. 90 to 95% of those who died in the wars following 1918 were civilians. 90 to 95% of those who died before 11th of November were soldiers. The subject of my lecture, therefore, is the civilianization of war. And I believe there is my friend Peter LeGroux, whom I see in the audience, tells me that there is a tribunal discussing war crimes of a kind that I believe are direct and powerful continuations of the process of the civilianization of war that began in the early part of the 20th century and is with us still. While we're speaking, that violence is continuing in Syria today and elsewhere. And hence, this lecture is an attempt to say how the history of violence in the early 20th century is playing out in violent ways today. The linkages are there, and the responsibility is there to take account of what is still going wrong in the civilianization of war. Now, therefore, I want to simply persuade you to accept 2 points. The first is that the war didn't end on the 11th of November, and that indeed between 1918 and 23, a second phase of the Great War, if you will, a second Great War, grew directly out of the 1914-18 conflict, largely because of the Russian Revolution. Not only, but largely. After all, the war engendered the revolution. There are many who believe the revolution would never have happened without the war, but it certainly was one of its products. Secondly, I want to convince you that the most striking difference between violence 1914-18 and violence 1918-23 is what I term the civilianization of violence. We can fully appreciate this mutation in war, or if you will, in the war after the war, by focusing not on the first or the first of the few of the peace treaties of the war, let's say that signed at Versailles or elsewhere, Versailles on the 28th of June 1919, but today on the last treaty, not at all as well known, signed at Lausanne in Switzerland on the 24th of July, 1923. On that day, the new character of war, in my belief, came fully into view, pointing to a further civilianization of war to come in the following years, and reaching, not only in Syria, to our own days. In effect, in November 1918, a world war fragmented into a series of decentered wars, which between 1918 and the end of 1923-24 devastated large parts of Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe. The death toll in the wars after 1918 was roughly the same, as I said, as that before 1918. And the vast majority of the victims of the second phase of the Great War were civilians. Now, the nature of this new cluster of wars, which I urge you to consider calling it the Second Great War, or the second phase of the war of 1914 to 23, differed from that of the early years, 14-18, which was essentially a war of imperial powers, fought to determine imperial hegemony both in Europe and throughout the world. The 11th of November signifies that Britain defeated Germany for mastery of northwestern Europe. That's the way in which I grew up. I think it's time to move on to a more global and transnational history of that war, instead of seeing the Anglo-German antagonism as the sum and essence of what the First World War was about. What we have yet to see clearly is that after 1918, a new kind of decentered warfare emerged, based at times on state power, they were national wars, but at other times on the contest between regional, ethnic, and confessional groups in some areas, and simultaneous class conflicts in these and in other areas. The key element separating the first phase of the Great War from the second was the fragmentation of national or imperial war efforts into domestic and transnational conflicts, dividing populations which between 1914 and 18 had fought for their nation or empire. Another way of putting this is to say after 1918, the enemy was next door, your neighbor. The decentering of warfare marked the Second Great War in another way. The collapse of empires, mixed with the commitment of the Allies under American pressure to the principle of self-determination, produced what Erez Manella termed the Wilsonian moment. What mattered most, he argued, was not what Wilson said, but what colonized people all over the world made of what he said. And what dozens of groups made of it was that it was time violently, in any way, to oppose the perpetuation of the post-war imperial system, which had both been reordered and, I believe, undermined by the First Great War. The reordering gave to Britain and France more imperial power than they had before. The undermining of that augmentation of imperial power arose from the fact that the war had impoverished both Britain and France, whose war debts, especially to the United States, had to be paid off. American generosity always has its limits. The onset of economic depression from 1920 on affected imperial countries more than non-imperial countries, and the cost of paying war pensions turned declining returns on international trade into annual budget deficits and crises in the interwar years. Thus, the great imperial powers increased their holdings, their territory, precisely at the moment they could not continue indefinitely to afford to have them. The Great War, therefore, was both the apogee and the beginning of the end of empire. Of course, in addition, the years 1917-23 saw an explosion of labor militancy. Let's see if I can show you this. This is a rough graph of the largest or the biggest phase of industrial militancy in the 20th century, which were the years 1917 to 23. This is not global, but it does indicate that you can identify the moment when the Union Sacrée came to an end, largely because of inflation and the inequality of the impact of inflation on different social groups, and the unwillingness of working class groups to take impoverishment forever. Between 1918 and 23 is the biggest phase of industrial militancy in terms of millions of days lost in the 20th century. Now, what I'm trying to suggest, something which I think is extraordinary, is that social unrest at home amplified colonial unrest abroad. Here is the context of the war-related birth of the anti-colonial movement, and this was global. Starting in Korea, the 1st of March, 1919, with massive demonstrations against the Japanese Empire, 1 million people marched in the streets of Seoul with Japanese police and military response of a kind that you would expect. Spreading to Amritsar in India, where the massacre of demonstrators at Jallianwala dissolved lingering imperial sentiment in India. Then to China, where enraged students burned down the telegraph office where they received word that the province of Shandong, Confucius's birthplace, would be given by Woodrow Wilson in the hands to the Japanese and not to the Chinese. Indeed, what we can suggest is that Woodrow Wilson was the godfather of the anti-colonial movement in China, which became known as the 4th of May movement in response to that announcement. The 4th of May movement is the embryonic form of the Chinese Communist Party. 1919 is the moment when self-determination took a turn, which is still evident today. If anyone mistook these developments as remote from Europe, they could look to Ireland, where a civil war started in 1916 and continued until 1923, or to Morocco, where an indigenous rebellion continued until 1928. Thus, insurrections marked the imperial world from 1916 on and continued to do so with greater and greater intensity in the decades that followed. Insurrections, civil wars, class conflict, ethnic violence reached a level during the Second Great War not known during the First. The best case I know about this is the city of Lemberg, the Austrian capital of Galicia, now known as Lvov, used to be called Lvov when it was Polish. Lemberg had not a single anti-Semitic incident in the years 1914 to 1918. On the 22nd of November, 10 days after the armistice, there broke out an anti-Semitic pogrom, which burned down the old Hasidic synagogue and center next to the marketplace, largely organized by Polish troops fighting Lithuanian troops for control of this part of Galicia. It's still contested. The Polish ambassador to the Ukraine refuses to admit that they were responsible, and the Ukrainian ambassador will, of course, not hear that the Ukrainians were. It was a Polish pogrom. There were 1,000 pogroms of a similar kind over the next 4 years. Now, I think the important point to understand is that one reason why this violence came out is the delegitimation of states. Once states and empires were delegitimized, either by being unable to deliver victory or to feed their people, or even worse, both, the monopoly central forces held over the lawful use of physical force collapsed. A Weberian state collapsed, and in its place, a degree of chaos and anarchy failed to control tensions which no doubt were there, but were placed under certain legal and moral rules. In its place came competing groups asserting their authority through violence, both expressive and instrumental, both symbolic of their claims and effective in destroying anyone who challenged them. By the way, there are two in the cemetery in Lvov. There are two graves of the unknown soldier, of the Polish-Ukrainian War. It could have been that the unknown soldier, the Polish unknown soldier, killed the Ukrainian unknown soldier, or the other way around. What makes it more sinister, though, and it makes my point about the civilianization of war being vivid and visible in these days, is that the Ukrainian unknown soldier lies next to the graves of between 250 and 300 members of the Galicia division of the SS, who died in fighting in that part of the Ukraine near Brody, when the the Red Army was pushing the Nazis. And they, by the way, lie next to 20 to 30, maybe perhaps more, men who lost their lives fighting Putin in 2014. So the beginning of the story is the Ukrainian-Polish Civil War. The end of the story has not been written. Now, this series of decentered wars were necessarily chaotic and involved sporadic rather than continual violence. In the Russian Civil War, different anti-Bolshevik groups worked either against each other or without coordination, thereby dooming the Allied intervention in support of them. Brigandage and warfare overlapped. That's the synagogue in Lvov that was burned down. This is a map of what territory the Bolsheviks actually controlled during the Civil War, and the 16 different armed groups that were never organized in any significant way together, each of which was aiming to overthrow the regime in different parts of what had been the Russian Empire. Brigandage and warfare overlapped, returning parts of Russia and of Eastern Europe to conditions of banditry and pillage of earlier centuries. Indeed, I believe that Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War indirectly helped to ensure the survival of the Bolshevik regime. The reason was that peasants did not want restoration. Why would they? They had just seized land with the overthrow of the Tsar and understood those who attempted to restore the old order as their enemies. The Allies made sure that that effort failed. Now, the second defining feature of the period 1918 to 24 is what I've already called the civilianization of violence. The first, if you will, is the mutation of war, fragmentation of war, decentralization. The mutation is probably the best word to use, because war is never one thing, it's always unstable. By civilianization, I mean that while civilians were targeted between 1914 and 1918 in a series of instances amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity, from German atrocities in Belgium and northern France in 1914, to the Armenian genocide of 1915, to the naval blockade of the Central Powers that continued after the armistice. The primary focus of the 1914-18 conflict was on mass armies and the fronts on which they were arrayed. Before 1918, the boundary between civilian and military targets had been eroded. We can find many instances of this. But after 1918, I believe that boundary between civilian and military targets was erased. Violence against civilians became the norm, and how to distinguish between armed bands under a recognizable authority and criminal bands was anybody's guess. If you want to see or feel the world in which this civilianization took place, I urge you to read Dr. Zhivago. Pasternak will introduce you to it. Now, in addition, the treatment of prisoners of war from Finland to Turkey became murderous in a way almost unknown during the war. Here is an example of a photograph that was widely circulated in 1919. Now, it's very hard to find it in Finnish textbooks because it's an embarrassment. The Finnish Civil War is still deeply troubling. The treatment of prisoners, which you can see on the right, is clear. More Finns, many more Finns, 70% of those who died in the war died after the end of combat. They died in prison or in summary executions after combat. Here was clearly a precedent for Franco's regime, which continued the killing of Republicans on a mass scale after the so-called end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939. Paul Preston has written a book on this, which I think is decisive. Now, the decentering of war created conditions which meant requisitioning supplies in the field. This meant killing, maiming, or beating peasants, destroying their homes, seizing their animals, theft on a grand scale. But it also entailed the use of hunger as a way of asserting the authority of an insurgent group. No one achieved a hold on power under conditions of economic chaos and epidemic disease. The years 1918 to 1923 are the years of the worst epidemic and endemic disease in European history, for which we have documentation. What the 14th century might tell us, anybody knows. But the years 1918 to 23 was the worst epidemic in European history on many levels. One, for example, is malaria. Farmers pushed off their land during the Balkan Wars of 1912-13, returned thereafter, but when fighting resumed in 1914 and then again in 1917, say in Macedonia, they fled, leaving an archipelago of stagnant pools of water, spawning the worst malaria epidemic ever known. Other diseases followed in its wake. There were epidemics of cholera, of dysentery, even plague returned to parts of war-torn Europe. After 1918, marked too by the ravages of the worst influenza pandemic the world had ever known. Now the question emerges, and should emerge in your mind, why did this second phase of the Great War come to an end? The first is the restoration of economic stability. The inflationary spiral of 1918 to 23 had made virtually had made recovery virtually impossible. And it took a multinational effort to stabilize both the German and other currencies. Secondly, the Western powers finally recognized the Bolshevik regime, and with Lenin's death in 1924, the revolutionary danger appeared to subside. Thirdly, and I think probably most importantly, sheer exhaustion diminished the capacity of warring groups to carry on the struggle. By 1924, Europe had become once again a continent of legitimate nation-states, but the stability of those states was compromised not only by the ravages of a decade of war, but also by the civilianization of the conflicts out of which many of those states emerged. Thank you. Now, I want to suggest that the new character of war was reflected in the last of the peace treaties that were signed to end the conflict, and that is the Treaty of Lausanne. And is a reason to choose but one instance to show what this meant. The last great upsurge of violence in the decade 1914 to 24 was the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 22. After the complete defeat of Greek forces in Anatolia, the war was brought to an end by the Treaty of Lausanne. This, by the way, is the treaty that was signed with the defunct Ottoman Empire. You can see what carving up a lost empire looks like. It is the great imperial game. Lord Curzon, British Foreign Secretary, said that the purpose of the Treaty of Sèvres was to find a surrogate group to control what was left of the rump of the Ottoman Empire. And that is in the green areas, which was to be under Greek control, along with initially Italian and then totally Greek control. Now, the Greek idea of restoring Byzantium was supported completely by Britain and France in 1919 and 1920. This was a mad idea. Imagine an idea called megali, a strange exaggeration of the beyond the realms of the possible. The important point, though, to bear in mind is that after the complete defeat of Greek forces in Anatolia in 1922, the war was brought to the end by the Treaty of Lausanne. And we have, therefore, the very first example of how the peace treaties at the end of the First World War could be rewritten through violence. Adolf Hitler was perfectly aware of what was going on. The second treaty tore up the earlier Treaty of Sèvres signed in 1920. Now, I think what is important to realize is that in the invasion, the Greek invasion is from the left, from the city of Smyrna, which no longer exists, it's now called Izmir, into the center of Anatolia. But from 1919, those Greek forces invading Anatolia proceeded to wreak havoc on Muslim villagers on their thrust towards Ankara in the east of the, to the right of the map, the new capital of post-imperial Turkey. Throughout this period, there were two capitals, Constantinople, where the remnants of those supporting the old Sultan were initially hoping for a British victory and a Greek victory alongside it. Then when it's obvious that that couldn't be the case, then Ankara became the capital of post-imperial Turkey. Over 1,000 Muslim villages were put to the sword, and their inhabitants suffered rape, pillage, and murder. This mad attempt at resurrecting the Byzantine Empire came to an abrupt end when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's forces blunted the Greek advance and then turned their retreat into a complete rout. Moving westward, you shouldn't be surprised by this, Turkish forces put Christian villages to the sword and proceeded to set fire to the ancient city of Smyrna, which burned to the ground. Allied forces accepted this fait accompli. Kemalist Turkey had arrived and they had to make peace with her, especially given the existence of the Bolshevik regime not very far away to the north. Now, what's critical in this very widely known set of photographs about the burning down of Smyrna is that these are two French destroyers who are photographing the burning of the city without offering to take on board any of the 50,000 people who are pressed to the quay, as Ernest Hemingway wrote about it sometime later. This is a view of the imperial acceptance of the New Order. And the New Order was Kemalist. Yes, Ataturk's forces rewrote the peace settlement of 1919-20 by the force of arms. And yes, the whole world was watching. You should remember that it's only a few months after this that Hitler and his buddies tried their first putsch, the beer hall putsch in Munich. It's well known. It was certainly news that was plastered all over the German press, and it was the press everywhere else. It was the beginning, this moment, of a similar attempt to use violence to rewrite Versailles in Germany. Now from violence to diplomacy. In 1923, the first massive revision of the peace treaty took place at Lausanne. The terms of that treaty tell us much about what I call the civilianization of war. Lausanne said as one of the conditions of peace, and I'm using the words they used, the unmixing of populations. This was a term used by a great humanitarian, Fridtjof Nansen, who in 1922, just before using that word, the need to unmix populations, won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on behalf of Russian refugees. He was the League of Nations High Commissioner for Russian refugees, and then they got rid of the word Russian for all refugees. Now, what's extraordinary about it is that the term unmixing meant maybe what we can say today, what we understand by the term unmixing is a sanitary metaphor. It means the forced expulsion of civilians. Now the term, I suppose, I believe it was originally a Russian invention, but now the term of art is ethnic cleansing, as if the removal of people of a different kind from a mixed community renders it purer, less susceptible to friction and conflict. This is what Nansen meant with unmixing of populations. Dirt, as anthropologist Mary Douglas put it, is matter out of place. Unmixing or ethnic cleansing is the removal of people out of place. What made the new language of expulsion particularly striking was that ethnicity was defined solely by religion. Citizenship was defined solely by religion, not by language, not by custom, not by memory, and not by history. In the Lausanne Treaty, the term Greeks meant Christians and not Muslims. And the term Turks meant Muslims and not Christians. I was trying to see if anyone had any place for my fellow brethren, the Jews, but they didn't count at this particular moment. It would come back to haunt them later. Christians living in Anatolia, as they had done for centuries, were out of place in the new Turkey, the winner of the Greco-Turkish War, the last spasm of this second phase of the violence that afflicted Europe from 1914 to 24. Muslims living in Greece, the losers of this war, were out of place in towns and villages in which they and their ancestors had lived for centuries. In fact, when the police came to expel populations, they came to villages in Cappadocia that didn't even know there had been a First World War, were untouched by it until they had to leave. And they had to leave for reasons related entirely to their religion, nothing else. What made this unmixing particularly brutal was that it was not voluntary. This is very important. This is a peace treaty that legitimized compulsory ethnic cleansing. That is what it did. In 1913, Greeks and Bulgarians exchanged populations. That's the other word. But this was a continuation of the long-standing tendency of civilians to flee conflict zones voluntarily. That, I would suggest, is a human right, to flee violence. Compulsory deportation is the elimination, it's the erasure of the concept of human rights. The Treaty of Lausanne is the opposite of the recognition of the human rights of those who are forced to leave their homes. It is the way the sociologist Jim Scott says, looking like a state. That's the way the state observes people. Human rights is looking at a human being, not in the Treaty of Lausanne. At Lausanne, civilian populations were hostages exchanged in the interests of peace, with the exception of Constantinople, where Greeks could stay, and in Western Thrace, where Muslims could stay. Everybody else in Greece and Turkey had to be unmixed, whether they liked it or not. The reason why Constantinople was left out was the Turkish government was well aware that the economy of Constantinople would collapse when the banks and the businessmen of the were heavily Greek, overwhelmingly Greek, would be forced to leave. The result was a population exchange of over 1 million Christians and over 500,000 Muslims. Here are the vectors of that movement. Those who had already fled before 1923 could not go back to their homes. They were included in the deported populations. Those still clinging to their homes were evicted forcibly from them. There was a mixed commission of League of Nations people, Greek government, and Turkish government emissaries to compensate those who had lost property, as if injustice could be prorated or commodified. But I don't think you should be surprised to know that the deliberations of this commission are still going on. They haven't reached the end of the negotiations. In 1924, through this peace settlement, forced expulsion was dignified by the force of international law. Some commentators have evaluated this treaty as a life-saving measure, a humanitarian measure. Nansen spoke to the delegates at Lausanne barely 10 weeks after the cosmopolitan city of Smyrna had been destroyed by fire. You've seen the images. Their unmixing meant murder and pillage. Everyone knew of the plight of the survivors of this event and of hundreds of thousands of others living in what had been a war zone. The forcible removal of civilians was, in Nansen's view, a humanitarian act essential to the securing of the, quote, true pacification of the region, and indeed of all Europe, unquote. The leaders of Greece and Turkey concurred, and so did the great powers, victorious in the Great War, the UK, the US, France, Italy, Romania, what would become Yugoslavia, and Japan. What is most striking about this peace treaty is the language it used to describe the war and the victims of war. In Smyrna, everyone saw that it was civilians who paid the price for the defeat of the Greek forces who had invaded Turkey after the so-called end of the 1914-18 war. At Lausanne, the civilianization of war became a principle of the fashioning of peace. The peace treaty would not have gone forward had it not had this ethnic cleansing. The new lexicon of war and peace emerged clearly in the diplomatic deliberations which spanned the period between October 1922 and July 23. The issue of the forced expulsion of civilians was raised on the 1st of December 1922 at the 8th meeting of the Territory and Military Commission of the Peace Conference. The chairman, Lord Curzon, said he had convened the commission, quote, in order to discuss a question of immediate importance arising directly out of the exchange of prisoners of war, namely the exchange of populations between Turkish and Greek territory. You see the move from the old war, where peace is when prisoners of war are exchanged, to the new kind of war when civilians are exchanged in order to end conflict. İsmet İnönü, the head of the Turkish delegation, second to Ataturk, and he became the second president of the Republic after the death of Ataturk, responded that he was surprised to see, quote unquote, on the program, a question not mentioned in the official agenda previously issued, which only included the question of exchanging prisoners of war. So he's asking, why are you adding, as if it wasn't in the interests of Turkey that this event come forward. It's a very clever move. The Turkish negotiators knew very well what was going on. All diplomatic negotiations are between victors and what they want. The position of the Greeks in this was to give the victors whatever they needed until they were satisfied and would go home. İnönü noted as well that he wasn't really prepared to recognize Nansen because he was a representative of the League of Nations, and they weren't a party to the organization at all. This, again, is a diplomatic code. Turkey, everyone was begging Turkey to become a member of the League of Nations, which they did right after the signing of the peace treaty. So what we see is the Turkish delegation affirming, as indeed diplomacy always does, the absolute right of a victorious state in war to determine what will happen at the end of a war and in the peace negotiations. Absolute state power, not human rights. That is what Lausanne is all about. Looking back from Lausanne, we can see that during the decade 1914 to 24, war progressively took on the character of violence directed against civilians. The culmination of this redefinition of war as violence against civilians directly and intentionally was the forced deportation of more than 1.5 million people. Part 6 of the treaty was a convention concerning the exchange of Greek and Turkish populations. It preceded Part 7, which concerned the reciprocal restitution of interned civilians in the exchange of prisoners of war. Here's a critical moment, I believe, in the history of war, when exchanging millions of civilians preceded, not only in legal terms, but in logic, the return of a much smaller number of prisoners of war. Those out of uniform paid the price for the return of those who had been in uniform and incarcerated. The civilianization of war had turned peacemaking into the expulsion of those who bore no responsibility for the war or for the horrors it had entailed. There's no legal justification for the expulsion of over 1 million Greek Orthodox people from Anatolia. 2 independent states accepted, and the entire peace conference underwrote the definition of citizenship determined by religion, and only by religion. As I have already noted, the expulsion was selective. The Greek Orthodox population of Constantinople, Imros and Tenedos, was exempted, as was the Muslim population of Thrace, ceded to Greece only in 1920. But all the rest of the Greek population of Anatolia and the Turkish population, in inverted commas, of course, of Greece, were forcibly uprooted and deported, thereby losing their citizenship on arrival in their new home. The critical issue here is the change from the time-honored ritual surrounding the return of prisoners of war into the strikingly new choreography surrounding the exchange of hostage populations, ethnically defined as civilian prisoners of war. When the termination of war was defined by the expulsion of millions of men, women, and children from the homes in which they and their ancestors had lived for generations, then it becomes evident, at least to me, that the character of the war to be ended had changed from that of wars in the past. Let's have a closer look, though, at the way the peace came about. There are many defenders of Nansen's view that he accepted an ugly reality to avoid something even worse. He was in Lausanne because he was the head of an international effort sponsored by the League to preserve the lives and dignities of millions of refugees. Now, 50,000 of these refugees, Russian refugees, wound up in Constantinople after Wrangel's armies were defeated and dispersed. Nansen found a way to provide these people with travel documents, now known as the Nansen passports. He also dealt with 2 other cognate problems: feeding refugees and protecting them and populations among them which sought shelter from endemic and epidemic disease, a subject on which both the Red Cross and the League of Nations did extraordinary work. So he was the man who spoke for refugees, and his voice counted in world affairs. He could not be accused lightly of being a cynical power broker without a concern for the lives of the people trapped in the aftermath of the Greco-Turkish War. His proposal of forced deportation was like surgery, painful but the only way to save the patient. This is how he put it. Anyone who has reflected upon what is involved in the displacement of populations of more than 1 million people, in uprooting these people from their homes, transferring them to a strange new country, and registering, valuing, and liquidating their individual property, which they abandon, and in securing to them the payment of their just claims to the value of this property, will understand that the difficulties are immense. I do not wish to be understood to say that I believe that any treaty which may be made for the exchange of the Greek and Turkish minorities will give entirely satisfactory results. On the contrary, I believe that any exchange of population, however well it were carried out, must impose very considerable hardships, perhaps very considerable impoverishment upon great numbers of the individuals concerned. But I also believe that these hardships, great though they may be, will be less than the hardships which will result from these same populations if we do nothing. Nansen argued that displaced populations could return to their farming in their new months. I think it's the only example that I know of where someone engaged in dealing with hunger and disease doesn't bring food to the hungry, he brings the hungry to food. He brings them to the farms that they need to cultivate in Greece or in Turkey, and the spaces in Turkey will be made available by their evacuation of deportees in the first place. This is the deal that the international world bought in Lausanne. It took time to reach agreement. After a Turkish walkout, the delegates reconvened, and finally the treaty was signed on the 24th of July, 1923. It was the last of the treaties of the Great War. It took another year for the Mixed Commission to establish the parameters of population exchange, and the initial stages of it were completed by the end of 1924. As I said, the legal aftermath enriched a whole generation of lawyers but not any of the families who were deported. Peace is the absence of war. In 1923, at Lausanne, it was defined in new terms as the forcible transfer of civilians who were citizens, not combatants, and against whom no charges of criminal activity were made. None of the deportees had broken a law. They were persecuted, I believe. They were deported not for what they did, but for who they were. Their crime was to be Greek Orthodox Christians in victorious Turkey or Muslim Turks in defeated Greece. Families who had lived in Saloniki for centuries were deported to Turkey. Other families who had made Cappadocia their home, as I said before, were deported to Greece. As one of these deportees put it, all these people were estranged from their pre-war lives and from their post-war fate. They lived then, as millions do now, caught between the sides of history, strangers, sides they did not choose. What had forced them to migrate was not war, but the peace settlement, which ended the decade of violence which had begun in 1914. Theirs was a fate common to many others in the 20th century and beyond. These people stand in the very long line of others who have suffered from this degeneration of war by war becoming violence against civilians. The philosopher Carl Schmitt created a framework in which to place and to justify the violent mutation of war in the years 1914 to 24. We know that Schmitt was interested in Lausanne and in international law in general. I haven't found a direct comment on it, but I believe his theories are accurate reflections of Lausanne. The two pillars of his thinking were these. First, he postulated that the sovereign state was he who could determine the state of exception, that moment when legal norms collapse in the interest of stabilizing the authority of a regime. His second principle is that he viewed politics as being framed by the appearance of the enemy, whose existence both determined and threatened the existence of the sovereign. Without enemies, sovereignty does not exist. With enemies, sovereignty creates the stability conditions of its rule by eliminating them. That's Carl Schmitt. Here, I believe we have the premise of the age of total war. Between 1914 and 1918, sovereigns at war declared a state of exception. After 1918, the state of exception became the norm. Between 1914 and 1918, states and empires defined their legitimacy by reference to existential enemies whose defeat was the prime condition of their survival. After 1918, existential enemies were not only on the other side of the line. They were next door, in adjacent streets, in the next village, in minority communities like Armenians or Greek Orthodox villages in Cappadocia whose inhabitants had lived with their Muslim neighbors for a millennium. After 1918, nationality became defined by religion, which in the language of the day elided with race. When the Treaty of Lausanne was signed on the 24th of July, 1923, a kind of peace began with the elements of war without end against enemies internal and external built into it. Here is the peace, as the Bible puts it, that passeth all understanding. The age of bare life, as Agamben said, the end of endless exception had begun. The era of endless exception had begun. This dolorous outcome is with us still. Now, just a number of brief conclusions. How unique was the transformation of war and peace in the decade 1914 to 24? There are those who claim that war has always entailed violence against non-combatants. Others claim that the savagery of the wars of religion of the 16th and 17th century, 30 Years' War, could lay claims to levels of cruelty and warfare little different from those of the 20th century. My response to those arguments is to insist on the determinant role of technology in separating 20th century warfare from earlier waves of armed conflict. Only after the Second Industrial Revolution, only after major changes in the techniques of mass production, after developments in metallurgy, chemistry, communications, aeronautics, did it become possible to launch industrialized war between global industrial powers. The Great War was at its heart an artillery war, and no one had ever seen the massive concentration of great guns which announced the onset of the battles of Verdun or the Somme. These battles have rightly been termed mega battles in that they transform the meaning of the term battle itself. Differences in degrees of violence deployed on the battlefield became differences in kind. The second objection to claiming that the decade 1914 to 24 was a revolution in violence is to urge historians to move the chronology of such changes back in time. Some claim that the Italian invasion of Libya in 1911 was the moment when the challenge to Ottoman power reached a critical point. made worse by losses in the two Balkan Wars of 1912-13. The reason for my refusal to accept this position is that neither the seizure of Libya nor the outcome of the Balkan Wars disturbed the international balance of power to an extent which imperiled the strategic interests of all the great powers. Only Sarajevo did that. Furthermore, while the destructive power of concentrations of heavy artillery was made visible to anybody who bought a newspaper in 1912 or 13 in Paris or Vienna, there was more to be learned about the new warfare from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, which presented trench warfare and its consequences to anyone who observed these matters. The first attempts to treat shell shock in a professional manner emerged in the Russian army, not in the Balkans. And Japanese scholars add, if we push the onset of industrial warfare to 1904, why not see the links with the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-5? Why not follow the line linking the cruelties of the Hamidian expulsions, massacres, murders of Armenians in 1894-96? Regression is the name of this game. It's recommended, too, by historians of the American Civil War, whose bloodbath rivaled in scale that of 1914-18 and after. None of these suggestions persuades me to change the chronology of my argument. I remain convinced that something unprecedented, something monstrous, happened in warfare in 1914, and it got worse after 1918. A final objection to consider is whether the source of this civilianization in warfare must be sought in colonial and imperial conflict and conquest. The Kaiser himself called for the extermination of the Herero people. Concentration camps emerged from the repression of uprisings against colonial rule in the Philippines and in South Africa. Australian violence against Aborigines was, according to the best scholarship to date, genocidal in character. As Malcolm X put it in 1963 in reference to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, was it not true that now the racial chicken had come home to roost? I reject this argument for two reasons. The violence that took place after 1918 happened in places, let's say like Poland, where colonialism was not an issue. The violence was something that happened in places where people had colonial pasts and in places where nobody had a colonial past. In addition, the embedded racism of European leaders and masses lay beyond the popular distinction between the norms of the treatment of white and non-white peoples. What mattered in 1914 was that the German army had committed atrocities against white Belgians. The fact that such brutality paled in comparison with what Belgians inflicted on the Congolese passed relatively unremarked at the time. The German soldiers who fought in South Africa, as we now know, were not committing atrocities in Belgium a decade later. The second reason why I resist the link between colonialism and the way much of the war in Europe was conducted is that before 1918, armies followed norms, which after the War of Movement of 1914 precluded the repetition of the atrocities of 1914. Even the expulsion of Jews, 500,000 Jews, by the Russian army came to an end when the Tsar simply fired the general, one of his cousins, who had ordered it. With the vacuum of power after 1918, those norms ceased to apply, and armed groups of all kinds committed crimes related not to Africa or Asia, but to the religious, ethnic, and social class divisions of their own societies. The violence of 1914 to 24 was European in character, and this was true of the end of the story as much as it was of the beginning. It is my view, although it's challenged by others, I admit the contested nature of this argument. I believe that had Greece not invaded Turkey in 1919 and attempted to take Ankara in 1921-22, the massacre and later forced deportation of 1 million Greek Orthodox residents of Anatolia, people who had lived there for a millennium, would not have taken place. Contingency matters. Events produce consequences. My conclusion is that in the years 1914-18, attacks on civilians occurred in all theaters of war, but they were not normative. They were exceptional. After 1918, such targeting of civilians became the norm, if not the raison d'etre of the conflict. The civilianization of war spread from Ireland to China, all over the world. And indeed, as we all know, from 1939, all over Europe. And now, in 2019, the civilianization of violence is evident on the West Bank, in Palestine, in Syria, and elsewhere. He or she who seeks evidence of its presence today should simply look around. Or listen. To the echoes of the voices of those who suffered through the Second Great War, 1918 to 23, and told us about it. One such witness, taking on the prophetic stance that she occupied much more visibly in 1938, one such witness was the poet Anna Akhmatova. Her poem, Why is the Century Worse?, written in 1919 after reports of several massacres of children in the Russian Civil War, can serve as an epitaph for the victims of this new phase of war, the civilianization of war. Why is this century worse than those that have gone before? In a stupor of sorrow and grief, it located the blackest wound, but somehow couldn't heal it. The earth's sun is still shining in the west, and the roofs of towns sparkle in its rays, while here death marks houses with crosses and calls in the crows, and the crows fly over. Thank you very much.
For a sobering and salutary presentation, for bringing a perhaps unknown aspect of history to light for many of us this evening, and also for making connections, of course, to the present day. So we are going to have a little bit of time now for questions. We'll take about 15 minutes or so. If any of you have questions, please raise your hand and we'll put them to Professor Winter. Okay.
Thank you. Professor, thank you very much for your interpretation of what happened, especially after the 1914, the Second Great War, as you put it. You mentioned the observing, watching role of the French frigates in front of Smyrna in 1922. I wonder whether you could tell us something about the British role in this adventure. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, well, by then the British and the French weren't talking to each other. They were engaged in getting out of the state of hostilities as quickly as possible. The French had a military expedition in the southeastern Cilicia, in the southeast of Anatolia, in part as a protective move to cover Syria and Lebanon, but also in part as a way of carving up Turkey according to the Ottoman Empire, which then still existed, to their benefit. And what happened in 1919, 1920, before the defeat, was that they were prepared to send the Greeks to fight for them, and then use the Greeks as a surrogate state for the imperial control of the Straits and of the Black Sea. In fact, that's what the Pontic Republic was supposed to be about. The Venizelos, who was an extraordinary, charismatic leader, brought this idea and was, in many respects, responsible for its launch. He wasn't responsible for its failure because Britain and France refused to pay for the maintenance of the lines of supply that followed. So what's important, I think, to realize is that perfidious Albion has fingerprints all over the story. The British wanted to use the Greeks to control Turkey. And then when the war got hot and there wasn't much to do about it, the Turks pushed the Greek army back to the edges of Constantinople, and Lloyd George insisted, time to go to war again. This is a moment where the British public said, no more. This is the lassitude. This is the moment when nobody wanted war to happen again. Nobody could possibly bring it about. And so he fell. He fell from power because he refused, or rather his cabinet refused to back him and literally got rid of him to make a basically conservative government, a pure conservative government, instead of an ex-liberal prime minister and demagogue as their prime minister. So the British position on the outcome of the Greco-Turkish War is terrible. I don't think there's any justification for it. And when Curzon, I spent a lot of time figuring out, why is Lord Curzon chairing a peace treaty? What is he doing? Why isn't the president of Switzerland doing it? Why isn't a neutral party? Don't forget that the initial treaty was between Britain, France, and the others as victorious powers, and the Ottoman Empire as a defeated one. And now it's the other way around. Now the Turks are in their position, so why is Curzon there? And the answer was, because he was a Balliol man and believed in that effortless superiority of controlling the world that he used when he was Viceroy of India. The British position in this is as old-fashioned as you can get. And in some respects, I think what we see is and Churchill, alas, was not very far from this, was the extent to which old imperialists believed they could play the new imperial game, even though the empire or the whole nature of empire changed radically. And Ataturk sat there through his delegate Inonu, his second in command, and said, this is a legitimate and entirely sovereign state which insists upon the terms of the peace. For example, they said, anyone uses the word Armenian. By the way, this is, I don't know if I can get back. I might. No, I can't. If you look at look at Armenia in the Treaty of Sèvres. Now look at the map of Turkey in the Treaty of Lausanne. It's vanished, it's gone. The Armenians were devoured by a Kemalist tiger and a Bolshevik lion. It's completely devoured, it's gone. Anybody mention the word Armenian in the Lausanne peace negotiations, the Turks walk out. Do you think Lord Curzon used the word? Of course not. They had to make peace with the power in the region and use him, they thought, in such a way as to prevent him from allying with the Bolsheviks, which was the worst nightmare that they could possibly have. So the way I look at British power in this period is as completely bankrupt of ideas of what to do in the Middle East, falling back on the old imperial concept that use a surrogate, and then failing to have that surrogate actually win a war, and therefore begging for favors from the victorious power, Kemalist Turkey. Yeah, there's a microphone coming.
First, thank you so much for a very insightful lecture. One small point first. As a sort of descendant of ethnic Bulgarians who were pushed out of Aegean Macedonia in 1923, from my grandmother and from her mother, whom I didn't have a chance to meet, I can assure you there was nothing voluntary in the population exchange. So I'm very sympathetic with the argument that the war extended very well until 1923 and even a little bit beyond, you know. And I agree with you that they did for economic reasons. The Greeks didn't cleanse northern Greece for economic reasons, and so Turks didn't cleanse Constantinople. But I'm thinking is a bigger problem here is that we have this transition from imperial sense, the Ottoman, the Byzantine, or the British controlling somehow, towards sort of a nation state. And I think it seems to me that the peak of civilian violence becomes at this transition stage because civilians are the ones who have to pay the price for the nation state. And I think it very much also speaks to what Europe is today. Europe consists of nations, but hopefully these nations are not the nations of 1923. But your thoughts about this transition and the rise of nationalism, because that also has to do with Armenia and with the other points. So your thoughts about that. Thank you so much.
Excellent point. I agree with you. The issue, partly I'm interested, my long friendship with Peter Lagru, about law and what law tells us about war. Because, you know, I presented versions of this paper in many military academies. And, you know, the armies are rule-driven. They're normative. You know, it's the Lieber Code that said in 1863 that when you put on a uniform, you don't cease to be a Christian. There are rules and norms of behavior. Now, what I think happens is the equal and appalling violence in Macedonia and Bulgaria, and of course in Armenia, went ahead in the earlier period without there being the fiat of international law saying that there is a requirement that these people leave their homes. It was understood that people will escape from a field of battle. The problem I have is the linkage between what happens in 1923 and what the Nazis do. And let's take a close example with this and with the Greek Civil War. How long is transition? The Greek Civil War was worse in some ways than the defeat of the Greek army by Ataturk. The scars are still there. The diaspora produced is all over the world. I know a good number of them in Australia, a very large community of Australians who have Greek origin who were looking for anywhere as far away from Greece as they could go, and they found it in Sydney and Melbourne. How long is transition? How long is transition in Yugoslavia? And if you think about it, what I think is important about this concept is that it links up with Milosevic, that it links up with the later 20th century, and with other elements of European history, not only the Holocaust, which, as you've seen, I've left out, but I think there is a long history of the identification of civilians as legitimate enemies, which becomes braced by the force of law in 1923. I don't know of any equivalent legal instrument which is still on the books today. It's part of international law, the Treaty of Lausanne. And yes, it's true, by the way, that the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928 attempted to move the goalposts a little bit further towards human rights and away from the absolute sovereignty of states. But it was quite clear. One of the puzzles I have is one of the people who negotiated this was a man called Socrates Politis, who was the second to Venizelos in the Greek delegation. And he became very close friends with René Cassin when they wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What was he doing in Lausanne? The exact opposite. None of the people covered by the Treaty of Lausanne had human rights. It's not there. And my student Bruno Caban has done some wonderful work on the beginnings of a human rights movement, and I think he's right about that. And Nansen's part of it. Nansen's a chapter in one of his books. The problem is that war is so, what shall I call it? Turbulent. It has so many destructive elements in it that it isn't only one thing. And Brodel said it 50 years ago, that we know as little of war as we do of the true nature of matter. Physicists would accept that. I think we historians have to see it too. There's a mutation that goes on. And we focused on 1418, rightly so. I've done it all my life. But once we turn our attention to Eastern Europe, it looks different. And when we do that, I wonder what we do to justify the quote-unquote celebration of the 11th of November. That's where I started. It's still there. It's become a metaphor. Of course it has. Synecdoche, the part stands for the whole. The problem is the part doesn't stand for the whole. If only it were true that the 11th of November was the end of the war, if only it were true that my argument was false, that after 1918 the violence got worse, I would be a very happy man if I was wrong. The problem is we're in the truth business, and I think there is a story to tell here, which is a long story and one that isn't over, that isn't completed. To make sense of the radical anti-Semitism of the interwar years, which the Nazis benefited from, is to see its difference from the anti-Semitism, radical and popular anti-Semitism of before 1914. And I think it's Judeo-Bolshevism which is the difference. It's the Russian Revolution. I would also add, if I had another hour, the concept of revolutionary war is war against everybody. Marxism has many different facets, and the way it developed under Lenin and then under Stalin meant that civilianization of war meant that Stalin waged war on his own people. That's what the Holodomor is about. It's a continuation of the same kind of civilianization of war, only this time against your own population. Well, Hitler did the same. Pol Pot did the same. It'd be interesting to know if these links that are long ones, but I think they're deep, can be extended as well to other parts of the world, maybe Rwanda. But I leave that open since I think it's dangerous to tread in waters on which you haven't done research. This area I know better, and I'm therefore prepared to say that we're living in a 100-year transition from one kind of war to another. What is Assad doing using poison gas against his own population? He's continuing the civilianization of war, and Putin is making it possible. Maybe not only Putin.
Joanna Urbanek, House of European History. I found, it is really fascinating lecture. Thank you very much. And what is what struck me in your lecture was the role of religion. The role of religion, which might have some impact on how we define this long continuity of war and how we draw the lines, maybe, or maybe I'm not right. So it is striking that citizenship is determined by religion in the examples that you pointed out. How far is that from national self-determination, the idea? It shows how failed idea it is actually at the time when we look at the Eastern Europe, when we look at the Turkey. And here is my question. What about the other notion of modernity? Where is this cut? We know that the Nazis, what they did, they changed the definition. For them, it was the race. You could be a Jew of a Christian religion, but you wouldn't be, you would still be targeted. Does it play a role in your defining these new lines when the war ends, another war starts? Is it something that you would consider it might be also important to take into account?
Thank you.
But for this fantastic idea of civilization of violence.
Well, I agree with you. The concept of, this goes back to the issue of Macedonia and Bulgaria and Greece. There was so much intermarriage, it's an absurdity. The concept that people's lives are determined by religion flew in the face of the reality of intermarriage. And under the law of the time, the wife took on the religion of, and therefore nationality, of her husband. Now, this is an absurdity. The notion that the Muslim and the Christian worlds were incompatible, in many respects, was obviously not true in the Ottoman Empire. And it was not true, and it's still not true, I would say, in the Balkans. It's just not true. If you visit Saloniki, Saloniki was a port which closed on Shabbos because all the stevedores were in synagogue. 50% of the population was Jewish. Was that a problem? No, not until the Nazis invaded it, and not until the collaborators enabled the Nazis to destroy the whole community, minus a handful of survivors. So the idea that nationality as religion is very dangerous and completely, that's why I'm so amazed at its easy passage. You can see why the diplomats said, we need to get rid of these people. Otherwise, they'll be massacred. So we're saving their lives by forcing them out of their homes. That's their logic. And one way to get rid of them is to say that they're all Greek because they're Greek Orthodox. Nothing could be further from the truth. That was not the description. If you did a census of these populations, nothing would bear that in mind. Now, what about the linkage to the present? I think, in my view, the concept of human rights is exactly the opposite of the concept of nationalism as religion. Exactly the opposite. That's where I go back to my older, it's published now, 8 years ago, the biography of René Cassin that I did with Antoine Pro. The reaction against this thinking is what the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights is all about. But they're in constant tension. They're in tension with each other. And the existence of communities in which religion defines citizenship is something that is still, I think, making difficulties. I'll give you an example. In the 24th of April 2015, the Catholicos of the Armenian Apostolic Church canonized 2 million saints, all the victims of the Armenian genocide. Why? Because the Armenian Church represented the nation. It was the nation. And of course, the Armenian population was mixed. It was very mixed in many different ways. But the Church stood for the nation. Now, I actually objected to that on the grounds that the reason why the Armenian genocide was to be condemned utterly and eternally is because it's an event that makes the concept of human rights meaningless. And that's indeed what the Universal Declaration was written to say. that either there is genocide or there are human rights. You can't have it both ways. Now, what do you say to the Armenian community? And Armenian nationalists did object to my position, saying it's easy for you to stand there and criticize us for not being human rights people, but for dealing with martyrdom. But the Turkish government hasn't given us a shred of what the German government gave to the Jews. Why are you treating us differently from any other group of people? What do we do when the Armenians say that religion defines their nationality? I've said my piece and got the bitter response that I've described to you. Perhaps you're braver than I am, you might try. But my guess is that when we deal with the mix of religion and nationality, we're dealing with explosive material. Anyone sees this in Poland. Anyone can see it, obviously, in other parts of Europe. It's not just Islamophobia that makes religion explosive. It was explosive long before. And I think it's likely to remain so. So it goes back to my point. If this is a transition, my God, it's taking a long time.
You made two important statements on the Lausanne Treaty. First, saying Kemal Mustafa came as a victor, and so he basically got what he wanted. And secondly, the population move of Greek Orthodox out of Anatolia and of Muslims out of Greece are one of the same kind. Isn't there an important difference between, on the one hand, the kind of realpolitik of nonsense saying, well, the expulsion of the Orthodox from Anatolia has taken place, trying to undo this is too complicated. And then the really extraordinary thing that happens, that is that the vanquished, the Greeks, who were first the aggressors and then lost the war they started, obtained the right to expel in peacetime 350,000 Muslims with the support of the international community. So wouldn't it be important to distinguish between the wartime expulsion of Orthodox from Anatolia and the peacetime expulsion from the vanquished of 350,000 Muslims?
It's a valid point. However, there were deportations of Greek Orthodox after, the 1923 to 24. I think basically by December 1924, the police had found all those villages in Cappadocia that are not on the map. In fact, one of them, one of my students was looking at, is still not on Google Maps. It just doesn't exist. But they found it and they got the people out. So what happens, I think, between 1922 and 1924 is a mixture of the old flight, inevitable flight of people running for their lives as they inevitably would, plus the response as what happened in Russia, that when villages were razed to the ground, the adjacent villages took to the hills initially, and then they took to the sea if they could possibly get there. And a substantial number of them made it. The fascinating thing about this is the sociology of the Greek state that came. This is a brilliant example of a forced integration bigger than that of the German population from the East after 1945. It's huge. It's 1.5 million in a population I think is between 5 and 6 million, and it's an enormous influx. It's on the scale of the victims of the Holocaust in Palestine, something similar. And you might say that there are parallels there, that these are people who had one choice, to leave or to die. That's basically it. And the Greek decision to accept them is partly because they got the quid pro quo of the rejection or of the deportation of Muslims, but it's also because they used an economic logic of humanitarian ideas, mainly that the people they're expelling will have homes because the Greek Orthodox people in Anatolia will vacate their homes, and this is what I mean by seeing like a state. It's not people we're talking about, but blocks of volatile populations. If you leave them where they are, they'll burst into flame. But if you pick them up and you move them one there, and by virtue of the fact that you have the right to deport the Muslims from Greece, there's a place for one group to go and a place for the other group to go. As I said, I've never come across someone dealing with epidemic disease and hunger by moving people to food. It's always the other way around. But moving people, forcibly, compulsorily moving people in order to end a war, in my view, is a break in the history of warfare. It's done in several phases. You're quite right to draw that point. But it's done in such a way that everyone knew it could be done again, and it was.
I think we have one last question here in the front row, and then maybe at that station as a wrap.
Hello, my name is Vanya Ivanova and I'm Bulgarian from origin, but I spent my 26 years here in Brussels working on integration in the European context, and I admire you for all these kind of messages you give us just in front of the 2020 year, and that we have 30 years from the fall of the Berlin Wall. So somehow I want to hear from you a message what we can do better in order to avoid, let's say, in Europe, this kind of atrocities, and also we can do more for the world that to give this model and maybe to integrate in a better way. Thank you.
Thank you. I can actually do that relatively briefly. I've always believed that the European project is a pacifist project. This is why I think Brexit is so crazy. You can argue it in 100 ways, but the notion that the European project is a turn away from wars seems to me self-evident in the early days of what Jean Monnet certainly thought, and quite a few others. So I still say that. The enemy is war. You know, Trotsky once said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. It is a mutant virus. When it breaks out, nobody can tell which way it's going to go, except it'll go badly. So my statement is that the history of the European Union is the history of a turn away from war. And anything that can be done to strengthen that pacifist project is necessary. Anything that makes the European Union ally to any wartime acts is something that I am completely against. It's a hard statement to see through, but I'll stand here. Pacifism is the answer I give you.
Okay. Okay, that's really, I think, a perfect note on which to end tonight's proceedings, which I'll do with two thank yous and a small note of housekeeping. I'd like to begin by thanking you all for coming and for supporting and continuing to support events here at the House of European History. Your presence this evening and on other evenings is very much appreciated. On that subject, you can join us next week for our panel debate on Restless Youth, our temporary exhibition, which will take place on Sinterklaas on the 6th of December, next Thursday, here in the exhibition spaces, where we'll have contributors to our catalogue talking in situ about youth over the last 70 years in Europe. And then, of course, the very last thank you is to Professor Jay Winter. It's been our ambition to have you here for a very long time, so we are delighted that you are here, and we hope that I think it's your first visit to the House of European History, and we hope it's the first of many. Thank you, and thank you all, and we'll see you all again soon. Okay, thank you.